South Carolina did not slowly become a plantation colony. It started as one. In 1670, when the first permanent English settlers landed on the Ashley River and founded Charlestown, they didn't arrive as farmers, figuring things out as they went. They arrived as wealthy sugar planters from Barbados, bringing with them a fully developed system of large-scale plantation agriculture and enslaved labor that the Caribbean colonies had already been refining for decades. Every other English colony on this continent built its economy gradually, through trial and error. South Carolina imported its economic model, fully assembled, on the same ships that carried its first colonists. This is the colony that didn't invent the plantation system. It brought the blueprint with it. Here's why South Carolina matters so much to the rest of this series. We've mentioned it constantly without ever telling its own story. It was the wealthy plantation economy across the Savannah River that drained Georgia's small farmers and broke the trustees' anti-slavery experiment within 20 years. It was the model that North Carolina, its own sibling colony, split away from in 1712, specifically because their interests had diverged so sharply. And it became, by the eve of the Revolution, the wealthiest colony per capita in British North America, built almost entirely on rice, indigo, and a system of enslaved labor so extensive that enslaved people actually outnumbered free colonists in South Carolina for most of the 18th century. This is the colony every other Southern colony was reacting to, competing with, or eventually copying. Today, we cover the full founding story of South Carolina, from the Lords Proprietors' 1663 charter and the Barbadian settlers who founded Charlestown in 1670, to the specific plantation and slave code systems they imported directly from the Caribbean, to the colony's split from North Carolina, to the rise of rice as South Carolina's founding cash crop, and Eliza Lucas Pinckney's breakthrough with indigo in the 1740s, to the Stono Rebellion of 1739, the largest slave uprising in the colonial South, and its brutal legal aftermath, and finally, to South Carolina's path through the Revolution and its ratification of the Constitution as the 8th state in 1788. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why South Carolina developed differently from every other colony in this series, and why that difference shaped the entire trajectory of the American South. Back to the beginning. South Carolina's origin begins with one of the largest single land grants in colonial history. In 1663, King Charles II rewarded 8 loyal supporters, a group known as the Lords Proprietors, with a charter for the entire territory of Carolina, an enormous tract stretching from Virginia's southern border to Spanish Florida. Among the most influential proprietors were Sir John Colleton and Anthony Ashley Cooper, both of whom already owned sugar plantations in Barbados and understood exactly what kind of colonists they wanted to recruit. Experienced Caribbean planters who already knew how to run a large-scale slave labor plantation and simply needed more land than the small island of Barbados could offer. This was not a charter granted to religious dissenters or land speculators hoping to discover a viable economy. It was granted to men who already had a working economic model and were looking for room to expand it. In April 1670, 3 ships carrying roughly 150 English colonists, many of them experienced planters and their enslaved workers from Barbados and Bermuda, landed at Albemarle Point on the Ashley River and founded Charlestown, named for King Charles II. Within a decade, the settlement relocated to a more defensible peninsula between the Ashley and Cooper Rivers, the site of modern Charleston. What made this founding distinct from Jamestown, Plymouth, or even Georgia's Savannah was the settlers' prior experience. These were not colonists improvising an economy from scratch. They arrived already knowing how to organize large plantations, how to manage enslaved labor at scale, and how to write legal codes that enforced that system, because they had already been doing exactly that in Barbados for 2 generations. The most consequential thing the Barbadian settlers brought with them was not a crop or a building technique, it was a legal system. Barbados had developed one of the earliest and harshest comprehensive slave codes in the English colonial world, and South Carolina's colonists adapted it almost directly for use in Carolina, formalizing it into law by 1691 and expanding it significantly afterward. These codes defined enslaved people as property in explicit legal terms, restricted their movement, assembly, and education, and established brutal punishments for resistance. Because South Carolina's colonists arrived already believing in and practicing this system, rather than developing it gradually as some other southern colonies did, its plantation economy scaled up far faster and far more completely than anywhere else on the mainland during the same period. South Carolina's colonists spent their first 2 decades experimenting with various crops before rice emerged by the 1690s as the colony's defining cash crop. The Low Country's extensive tidal marshes and river systems turned out to be nearly ideal for rice cultivation, which required precisely engineered systems of flooding and draining fields, a labor-intensive process that enslaved workers, some of whom brought direct rice farming knowledge from West Africa, were forced to design, build, and maintain. Rice transformed South Carolina from a modest trading outpost into one of the wealthiest agricultural economies in English North America, and by the early 1700s, Charleston had become the busiest port south of Philadelphia, exporting rice and increasingly enslaved people themselves throughout the Atlantic world. South Carolina and North Carolina began as a single proprietary colony, but the 2 regions had almost nothing in common. The northern settlements around Albemarle Sound were populated by small farmers, many of them dissenters and Quakers who had drifted down from Virginia, while the southern settlements around Charlestown were dominated by wealthy slave-holding rice planters with direct Caribbean connections. These 2 populations disagreed on nearly everything, from religious policy to trade regulation to basic governance, and the Lords Proprietors formally divided the colony into North Carolina and South Carolina in 1712 to manage the growing political tension between them. The divide became permanent in 1729, when 7 of the remaining proprietors sold their interests back to the crown, and both colonies became separate, fully royal colonies for the remainder of the colonial period. By the early 1700s, South Carolina's rice wealth had produced something genuinely unique among the English mainland colonies, a small, extraordinarily wealthy planter aristocracy concentrated in Charleston, whose lifestyle rivaled the English gentry itself. These planters built substantial townhouses in Charleston for the social season, while operating vast rice plantations along the surrounding rivers, staffed almost entirely by enslaved labor. By the 1720s and continuing through the century, enslaved Africans and their descendants actually outnumbered the free colonial population in South Carolina, a demographic reality found in no other mainland English colony at this scale. This concentration of wealth in so few hands, built on the labor of a majority enslaved population, would define South Carolina's social and political character for the remainder of its colonial existence and well beyond. On the morning of September 9, 1739, roughly 20 enslaved South Carolinians, likely led by a man named Jemmy, gathered near the Stono River about 20 miles southwest of Charleston, seized weapons and gunpowder from a store, and began marching south towards Spanish Florida, where Spain had promised freedom to enslaved people who escaped British colonies. Along the way, their numbers grew to somewhere between 60 and 100 people. By that afternoon, an armed colonial militia caught up with them, and in the fighting that followed, more than 20 white colonists and even more enslaved rebels were killed. This was the Stono Rebellion, the largest uprising of enslaved people in the mainland British colonies before the American Revolution, and it terrified South Carolina's planter class into passing an even harsher slave code the following year, further restricting the movement, education, and assembly of enslaved people across the colony. Before we get to Eliza Lucas Pinckney's Indigo breakthrough and South Carolina's path through the Revolution, comment below. 12 episodes in now, across an expanded 15-episode series. South Carolina is the first colony we've covered whose founding economic and legal system was directly imported rather than developed on the mainland. Does that change how you think about the difference between South Carolina and its neighbors? I read every reply. South Carolina's economy gained a crucial second cash crop in the early 1740s, thanks largely to a teenage plantation manager named Eliza Lucas, later Eliza Lucas Pinckney. Left in charge of her family's several plantations while her father served as a colonial governor elsewhere in the empire, Lucas spent years experimenting with indigo, a notoriously difficult crop to cultivate and process into dye, eventually developing a successful method suited to South Carolina's soil and climate. She shared her seeds and techniques freely with neighboring planters, rather than keeping the knowledge to herself, and by the 1750s, indigo had become South Carolina's second major export alongside rice, diversifying the colony's economy and adding even more enslaved labor demand, since indigo processing was notoriously dangerous and labor-intensive work. By the mid-1700s, South Carolina's population reflected the full scale of its plantation economy. Enslaved Africans and their descendants made up the clear majority of the colony's population for most of the 18th century, a demographic reality that shaped everything from the colony's architecture to its constant, deep-seated fear of rebellion, a fear that had already been realized once at Stono and never fully faded afterward. Charleston itself developed into a major hub of the transatlantic and domestic slave trade, with historians estimating that a substantial share of all enslaved Africans brought to Britain's mainland colonies passed through its port at some point. This demographic and economic reality made South Carolina structurally different from Virginia, Georgia, or any other colony covered so far in this series. Let me draw the comparison that this whole episode has been building toward. Georgia's trustees studied South Carolina and tried on purpose to build something different and failed within 20 years. Virginia's tobacco economy developed its own plantation system gradually, over nearly a century, adapting as it went. South Carolina skipped that entire developmental process. It arrived with experienced planters, a working legal framework for enslaved labor, and direct Caribbean trade connections already established, which meant its plantation economy reached full scale within a single generation rather than several. When people talk about the antebellum South's plantation system as if it emerged from Southern conditions alone, South Carolina is the clearest counterexample. Its system was largely assembled elsewhere and simply relocated. Geography shaped what crops worked. It did not shape the fundamental decision to build the colony this way. That decision had already been made in Barbados before the first ship ever reached Carolina. South Carolina's relationship with the revolutionary movement was shaped heavily by its planter elite's economic interests. Wealthy Charleston merchants and planters had grown accustomed to significant self-governance and resented British trade restrictions that limited their profits from rice and indigo exports, making many of them early and enthusiastic supporters of resistance to Parliament. South Carolina sent delegates to both the First and Second Continental Congresses, and Charleston successfully repelled a major British naval assault in June 1776 at the Battle of Sullivan's Island, a significant early American victory that boosted morale across the colonies. South Carolina's wealthy planter class largely saw independence as consistent with protecting the very economic system and the political autonomy that had made them so prosperous in the first place. South Carolina's Revolutionary War experience turned dramatically harder in 1780, when a British force laid siege to Charleston and forced the surrender of the entire American garrison in May of that year, one of the most significant American defeats of the entire war. British forces then occupied much of South Carolina for the next 2 years, and the state became the site of brutal, often personal partisan warfare between American militia leaders like Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens, and Loyalist forces loyal to the Crown. More significant battles were fought in South Carolina than in any other state during the Revolution, and the fighting there was frequently marked by exceptional violence between neighbors on opposing sides, a civil war within the larger Revolutionary War. After the war, South Carolina's planter elite once again shaped the state's approach to national politics. South Carolina's ratifying convention met in Charleston in May 1788, and on May 23rd of that year, the state voted to ratify the U.S. Constitution, becoming the 8th state to join the Union. South Carolina's delegates had pushed hard during the Constitutional Convention itself for protections of the slave trade and enslaved property, provisions that were written into the Constitution's structure through compromises like the 3/5 Clause and a 20-year guarantee against banning the importation of enslaved people. South Carolina's ratification was, in many respects, a calculated bet that the new federal system would protect the same economic and social order the colony had imported from Barbados more than a century earlier. South Carolina's colonial landscape remains one of the most visually distinctive in this entire series. The tidal marshes and barrier islands of the Low Country, the moss-draped live oaks, the elegant, still-standing colonial architecture of historic Charleston, with its ironwork balconies and hidden courtyards. This landscape, so different from the rocky New England coast or Virginia's tobacco country, was precisely what made rice cultivation possible in the first place, and it remains the physical stage on which South Carolina's entire colonial story played out. Extraordinary natural beauty existing alongside one of the most extensively developed plantation slave economies in British North America. South Carolina's place in this series forces a specific correction to how we usually talk about colonial development. Virginia's plantation system emerged gradually from tobacco speculation. Georgia's founders tried, and failed, to prevent a plantation system through deliberate engineering. South Carolina did neither. It arrived with the system fully formed, built by experienced Caribbean planters who knew precisely what they wanted before they ever saw Carolina soil. That distinction matters because it changes the causal story. South Carolina's plantation economy was not an inevitable response to Southern geography or climate. It was a specific, transportable set of decisions, refined in Barbados, that found new and profitable ground on the American mainland. Understanding South Carolina correctly means understanding that the Atlantic world's plantation economies were never separate regional inventions. They were one interconnected system, and South Carolina is the clearest place in this entire series where you can watch that system cross an ocean fully intact. Charleston today remains one of the best preserved colonial cities in the country, its architecture a direct, visible legacy of the wealth its rice and indigo economy generated. That same historic district also sits within walking distance of sites tied directly to the Stono Rebellion's aftermath and the transatlantic slave trade that built so much of the city's early wealth, including what is now a museum dedicated to honestly telling that history at the site of a former slave auction gallery. South Carolina's colonial story is not a simple one, and it should not be told as one. It is the story of extraordinary wealth, genuine architectural and agricultural achievement, and a deliberately imported system of forced labor that shaped the entire trajectory of the American South for the next 2 centuries. That's South Carolina, episode 12 of 15. Next up is South Carolina's sibling colony that split away in 1712 for exactly the opposite reasons. North Carolina, a colony of small farmers, dissenters, and the famous lost colony of Roanoke that vanished more than 80 years before Charleston was even founded. Episode 13 is next, and then we move into the 2 synthesis episodes that will finally bring this entire series together. Subscribe, hit the bell, and I'll see you there.